The coffee was still hot when they knocked on the door. I remember that detail clearly because I had just poured it, standing in my own kitchen in the house I had lived in for 31 years, and I hadn't even taken a first sip. The mug was sitting on the counter next to the sink, steam rising off the top. And then I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, the kind that aren't asking permission. It had been 18 hours since we buried my wife. I set the mug down and walked to the door, and I thought for just a second that maybe it was Pastor Ellison coming to check on me. He had done that the evening before. Stayed for almost an hour. Didn't say much. Just sat in the living room with me while the light changed outside. That was enough. That was more than enough. But it wasn't Pastor Ellison. My son was standing on the porch with his arms crossed. My daughter was a half step behind him, sunglasses on, even though the sky was overcast. Her husband was in the driveway leaning against their SUV looking at his phone. He didn't bother coming to the door. I looked at my son for a moment. He had his mother's eyes. He had always had his mother's eyes. And for a long time, that used to make me feel something warm. Standing there that morning, it just made me tired. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk. Let me back up because if I start there at the door with the coffee going cold behind me, then none of it makes sense without what came before." My wife's name was Carol. We met when I was 26 and she was 24 at a hardware store of all places. I was trying to fix a leaking pipe in my first apartment and I genuinely did not know what I was doing. She was buying paint. She pointed me to the right aisle without me even asking, just saw the lost look on my face and walked me over. We talked for 40 minutes in that store. I asked her to dinner before she reached the checkout line. We were married 11 months later. We had 2 children. My son, I'll call him Derek, and my daughter, who I'll call Renee. They grew up in a house in central Ohio that Carol and I bought when Derek was 2 years old. 3 bedrooms, a big yard, a porch with a swing that Carol repainted every few years when the color started to fade. She cared about that house. She cared about everything in it. For 30 years, that house was full. Noise, dinner smells, arguments over the TV, birthdays, Thanksgivings, the dog we had for 14 years who was buried under the oak tree in the backyard full. Then the kids grew up and moved out and it got quieter, which was fine. That's the natural order of things. Carol and I settled into that quiet the way you settle into a good chair. It took some getting used to, but eventually it fit. What I didn't expect was the phone calls slowing down, the visits getting shorter, the holidays where they'd show up for 3 hours, eat and leave before dessert was finished. I told myself it was just life. People get busy. They have their own families. Carol told me something different. She said, "Raymond, our children love us when it's convenient. I don't know when that happened, but it happened." She said it quietly one evening in February, sitting at the kitchen table while I was doing the dishes. She said, "It the way you say something you've been holding for a very long time and finally just don't have the energy to hold anymore." I turned off the faucet. I didn't say anything right away because I didn't know what to say. I knew she was right. I just didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. Carol was diagnosed 14 months before she died. Ovarian cancer caught late. The doctors were honest with us from the beginning, which I appreciated, even though it broke something open in my chest that I don't think ever fully closed again. During those 14 months, Derek came to visit 3 times. Renee came twice. I am not exaggerating those numbers. I kept track, not because I wanted ammunition, but because I kept hoping the count would go up. They called occasionally. They asked how she was doing, and Carol always said managing or having a good week or the new medication is helping. She protected them from the bad days. Even then, even when she could barely keep water down, even when she couldn't get out of bed, she would pick up the phone and tell them she was doing fine because she didn't want to worry them. I used to sit next to her during those calls and listen to her gentle the truth. I would hold her hand and think about the kind of person she was, how much she loved those 2 children, how much she had sacrificed over 40 years to give them good lives, good educations, good starts. Once after she hung up with Renee, she looked at me and said, "Do you think they know how much I love them?" "Yes," I said. "They know." She nodded and looked out the window. I'm not sure either of us fully believed it. The funeral was on a Thursday. October, cold and gray. The kind of day that feels appropriate for a funeral and also somehow makes everything worse. 41 people came. Friends from church, neighbors, a few of Carol's co-workers from the school where she had worked as a librarian for 22 years. Her sister drove up from Kentucky. Derek and Renee came. I want to be fair. They were there, but they sat on the far end of the family row, and I noticed the whole service. They were looking at their phones. Not constantly, just enough. And when it was over, Derek said he needed to get back because of work. Renee's husband had already started the car. I stood at the graveside after everyone left the funeral home. People were waiting politely at a distance. The clouds had dropped and it was starting to mist. I stood there anyway. 40 years. She and I had built 40 years together. And she was in the ground, and I was standing in the rain by myself. I didn't cry right then. I had been crying for weeks. I think I had emptied out somewhere around the third day in the hospital when it became clear there were no more options. By the funeral, I was just still like a house after a storm passes through. I drove home, I made coffee. The mug was still steaming when they knocked. We need to talk, Derek said. I stepped back and let them in. Carol would have wanted me to. That's the truth. We sat in the living room. Derek took the armchair. Renee sat on the couch, sunglasses finally off, hands folded in her lap. I sat across from them in the chair by the window. Carol's chair, technically, though she would have told me not to think of it that way. We've been talking, Derek started, about the house and about Mom's estate. I looked at him. We know how these things work, Dad. Mom owned half the house. That means her share passes to her estate, which means it gets divided. I said, Your mother and I owned this house jointly for 31 years. Right. But now that she's gone, Derek, he stopped. Your mother's funeral was yesterday. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, but only for a moment. We're not trying to be insensitive. We just think it's better to handle these things while everyone is still calm and thinking clearly. Renee hadn't said anything yet. She was looking at the bookshelves along the wall, the ones Carol had spent years filling. She was looking at them the way someone looks at furniture at an estate sale. Estimating. We're thinking, Derek continued, that the cleanest solution would be for you to sell the house. We split the proceeds 3 ways. You use your portion to downsize, maybe move closer to us. Or into a community, Renee said. First words she'd said since sitting down. I turned to look at her. A community? An independent living place. Some of them are really nice, Dad. You'd have people around. You wouldn't have to manage all of this by yourself. She gestured around the room. At 31 years of our lives, I sat with that for a minute. Outside, a car went by on the street. Someone's dog was barking a couple houses down. I want you both to go home, I said. Derek frowned. Dad, not permanently. Just right now, go home. We can talk in a few days. We're just trying to think practically. I understand what you're trying to do. I stood up and I need you to understand that I buried your mother 18 hours ago. I would like you to leave now. They left. Renee squeezed my arm on the way out, which I didn't pull away from, even though part of me wanted to. Derek said he'd call in a few days. His voice had the careful tone of someone who was deciding whether to be heard or not. I went back to the kitchen. The coffee was cold. I poured it down the sink and stood at the window for a long time watching the empty backyard. What I have not told you yet is what I already knew. 6 weeks. Welcome back to Revenge with Victor. Subscribe this channel for daily new story before Carol died. 6 weeks when she could still sit up, when we were still having whole conversations, when she was still Carol in every way that mattered. She had asked me to drive her to see a man named Gerald Hutchkins. Gerald was an estate attorney who had an office on the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown. She had made the appointment herself. I drove her. I waited in the car because she asked me to. She was inside for almost 2 hours. When she came out, she was tired but steady. She got in the passenger seat and I handed her the thermos of tea I'd brought and she held it in both hands and said, "Okay." I took care of it. I asked her what she'd taken care of. She said, "Everything that needed to be." I asked if I should know the details. She looked at me and said, "You'll know when you need to. For right now, I need you to trust me." I trusted her for 40 years. I wasn't going to stop in the parking lot of an attorney's office, so I drove her home and she napped on the couch and I sat in the kitchen and read. And that was that. 3 weeks after the funeral, after Derek and Renee had each called twice more, voices getting incrementally less patient, I got a call from Gerald Hutchinson's office. I sat across from Gerald Hutchkins in an office that smelled like old paper and lemonwood polish. He was about 65, reading glasses on the end of his nose, a yellow legal pad in front of him, even though everything was probably saved on his computer. Some people's habits are older than their technology. He slid a document across the desk. "Your wife was very clear about her wishes," he said, "and she went to considerable lengths to make sure they'd hold up the house. Carol had already transferred her share of the deed to me fully and completely before she died. The transfer had been notarized and filed. Her half was mine. The house was mine. But that wasn't all. Carol had a life insurance policy that Derek and Renee didn't know about. She had quietly maintained it for 19 years, adjusting it as her salary from the library allowed. The beneficiary was not me. The beneficiary was a trust. The trust was set up for our grandchildren. Carol had 3 grandchildren. Derek's 2 kids, who were 8 and 12, and Renee's daughter, who had just turned 7. The trust was structured so that each grandchild would receive their portion at 25, not 18, with funds available before that only for education expenses and verified medical needs. Carol had also written the letter to accompany the trust documentation. Gerald handed it to me sealed. "She asked that you read it privately," he said, "and that you decide whether to share it." I drove home with that envelope on the passenger seat. I didn't open it right away. I made dinner, ate it at the kitchen table, washed my plate, dried my plate, put it away. Then I sat down at the table with a cup of decaf and I opened it. I'm not going to share the whole letter. Some of it is between me and Carol, but one part I'll give you because it's the part that explains everything. I love Derek and Renee. I want you to know that is still true even now, even after everything. But I have watched them become people who confuse love with what love provides. I don't know where I went wrong, and I've stopped trying to figure that out. What I know is that I will not let them do to you what they have been practicing doing for years. You gave your whole life to this family. What's left of mine is yours. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. I called Derek the next day and asked him to come over. I called Renee separately and asked her to come too. I told them both the same thing. There are some things about your mother's estate you should hear. They came on a Saturday morning. Derek came alone. Renee brought her husband, which I had not invited him, but I let it go. We sat at the kitchen table, which felt right. The kitchen was where Carol had lived, where she'd made every holiday meal we'd ever had, where she'd sat with each of the kids to homework and heartbreaks and bad decisions, where she'd stood at the window on winter mornings watching the birds at the feeder she hung on the fence post. I told them about the house first. Derek's face changed when I explained the deed transfer. A small shift, but I'd known that face for 39 years. It was the face of someone recalculating. When did she do that? Renee asked. 6 weeks before she passed. And she didn't tell us. No, I said. She didn't. Renee looked at her husband. He looked back at her with his eyebrows slightly raised in that way that telegraphs an entire conversation. Dad, Derek said, measured now careful, something like that done right before she died when she was ill. There could be questions about whether she was in the right state of mind to Gerald Hutchkins had her mental competency certified by 2 independent physicians at the time of the transfer. I said he anticipated that question. Silence. I told them about the trust. Derek asked the dollar amounts. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So that goes directly to the grandkids, bypassing us. It was your mother's money. I said, from her policy and her name, she could direct it wherever she chose. Can it be contested? I looked at my son, this man who had his mother's eyes, who had driven 3 hours to his mother's funeral, and then pointed at his watch before the reception ended. You could try, I said. Gerald says it would be very expensive, very unlikely to succeed, and very public. Another silence. Renee started crying. I don't say that to be cruel. I believe her tears were real. She had loved her mother in the way people love things they take for granted, genuinely but carelessly. When the thing is gone, the love suddenly has nowhere to go and it comes out hard. She must have been so angry at us, Renee said. I thought about the letter on the top shelf of my closet. She wasn't angry. I said she was tired. They left an hour later, not with the same energy they'd come with the morning after the funeral. Something had gone out of them. Or maybe it was just that the calculation they'd been running in the background, the one about what they were owed, had finally returned an answer they hadn't expected. Derek stopped at the door and said, I'm sorry, Dad, about all of it. I believed him. I believe most people are sorry eventually. I just think sorry and changed are two different things, and which one comes out of a moment like this depends entirely on the person. I told him I'd see him at Christmas. I meant it. Renee hugged me at the door longer than usual. Her daughter, my granddaughter, had her piano recital the following weekend, she said. She hoped I would come. I'll be there, I said. And I was. There's an end to this story, though. I'm not sure end is the right word. Life doesn't really end. It just changes weight. I kept the house. Obviously, 31 years is not something you walk away from because 2 grown children did the math wrong. I fixed the gutter on the north side that had been pulling away from the fascia. I repainted the porch swing, same color Carol always used, a soft colonial blue I found by taking one of the old chip pieces to the hardware store and asking them to match it. I sat on that swing a lot that first winter. Cold nights mostly wrapped in the old barn coat I've had since I was 50, watching the neighborhood quiet down, thinking about Carol in the way you think about someone when they've become part of the air around you. Not as a memory exactly, more like a presence that shifted form. The grandchildren came to see me more that year than they ever had before. I don't think Derek or Renee orchestrated that intentionally, but maybe they thought it couldn't hurt. Either way, I was glad to have them. My oldest grandson started asking me about woodworking. So we set up a small bench in the garage and I started teaching him the basics on Saturday mornings. My granddaughter, the piano one, plays a piece for me every time she visits, standing in the living room. Very serious, very precise. Then, looking up at me after the last note to see my face. I always make sure my face is worth looking up to is a question I get asked sometimes. Well, not literally, but I've heard versions of it in my own head, in Carol's voice, in the voices of neighbors and friends. Was I angry? Am I angry? Honestly, less than you'd think. I'm sad about who my children became. I'm sad about the years Carol spent softening her edges around them. I'm sad about the phone calls she made from a hospital bed, telling them she was fine when she was anything but. I carry that sadness. It doesn't go away. But I am standing in my own kitchen every morning. I am walking out to the backyard and past the oak tree. And I think about the dog buried there. And I think about Carol, and I think about 31 years of dinners and arguments and ordinary evenings. And I think I have had a good life, a genuinely good life, not a perfect one, not a painless one, but good. Carol knew what she was doing that afternoon in Gerald Hutchkins's office. She was protecting me the way she had always protected the people she loved, quietly, completely, without needing credit for it. She did it one last time, and it worked. That's the kind of woman she was. That's the kind of woman she always was. I'm going to go check on the porch swing now. The paint should be dry. I've thought a lot about what Carol actually did that afternoon in Gerald's office. Not the legal part, the human part. She was sick. She was tired in a way I couldn't fully reach, no matter how close I sat. And instead of spending whatever energy she had left on bitterness, or on trying to fix Derek and Renee with words that wouldn't have landed anyway, she did something quiet and permanent and smart. She thought it through. She planned. She protected. That's not luck. That's character built over a lifetime. I think about the cause and effect of it all more than I expected to. Not in a religious sense. I'm not talking about the universe balancing some cosmic ledger. I mean something more practical, more human. The way you live determines what you leave behind. Carol spent 40 years being the kind of person who showed up, who thought ahead, who loved people even when they made it hard. And when the moment came that actually mattered, she had something to draw from. She had built something real. You can't fake that at the end. It's either there or it isn't. Derek and Renee had been making choices too for years. Small ones mostly. Not calling, leaving early, measuring. Every time they treated a visit like an obligation, they were quietly deciding what kind of people they were becoming. You don't arrive at that kitchen table the morning after your mother's funeral demanding a share of the house, unless you've been practicing that way of thinking for a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. It compounds. I'm not saying they're lost. I genuinely don't believe that. Derek's apology at the door that Saturday. I believe it was real. Renee's hug was real. People can reckon with themselves when the math finally comes back wrong. What I hope is that the reckoning sticks, that it changes something forward, not just backward. As for me, I learned something about what it means to stay steady. There were moments in those first weeks after Carol died when the grief was so heavy, I couldn't imagine having a conversation with anyone, let alone sitting across a table from my own children while they talked about square footage and estate shares. But I didn't collapse. I didn't rage. I sat in Carol's chair and I listened. And then I asked them to leave, and that was enough for that day. Steadiness is a kind of intelligence. It took me a long time to understand that when you don't react from the worst version of yourself, when you hold the line without cruelty, you give the situation room to resolve into something true. Carol knew that. She lived that way her whole life. I watched her do it for 40 years, and I still had to learn it mostly by watching her be gone. The grandchildren come over on Saturdays now. My grandson is getting good with the hand plane. My granddaughter played a Chopin piece last week, standing in the living room in her socks, completely serious. And when she looked up after the last note, I made sure my face showed her exactly what I felt. That's the through line, not the house, not the deed, not what Derek and Renee did or didn't get. The through line is the 8-year-old boy learning to follow the grain of the wood, and the 7-year-old girl who needs someone in the room whose face is worth looking up to. Carol made sure I was still here for that. That's what I keep coming back to. That's what I think about on the porch when the evening gets